Good to be with you. Thank you, music team, for leading us out so well. A wonderful selection of songs that dovetail so nicely with this passage that's before us today. Undoubtedly, you've heard the expression, they spoke better than they knew. It means that sometimes people speak words that actually are even more insightful or profound or accurate or meaningful than originally thought. Remember Caiaphas back in, or over in John's Gospel, chapter 11. Caiaphas and the high priests are concerned about the growing influence of Jesus, and his popularity, and the implications that held for them politically. And he suggested, Caiaphas did, that it would be better for one man, if one man died for the people, than for the whole nation to perish. And of course, his words were spoken from the standpoint of political advantage, political strategy that was to justify the death of Jesus. That ended up being an incredibly profound statement. The sacrificial death of Jesus, he'd die a substitutionary death on behalf of all people in order to accomplish the plan of God. It was a case of he spoke better than he knew. And sometimes we do that. Sometimes people speak better than they know, and sometimes people do better than they know. In Genesis 45, Joseph's words to his brothers, after he has revealed himself to them, they have sold him into slavery years before, and he reassured them and explained how God had used those actions, those plans to accomplish God's purposes. They did it out of spite, they did it out of jealousy, they did it out of envy, they just wanted to get Joseph away from them. They did better than they knew. Sometimes we speak better than we know, and sometimes we do better than we know. And I would suggest that in this passage that's before us this morning, that we're going to see both of those realities come before us in the participants that are featured here. Last week, Steve Seaman dealt with a passage that comes to us at the end of chapter 20, the story of the two blind men and the healing of those two blind men. Those blind men that were sitting on the side of the road and crying out to Jesus. Others perceived them to be a nuisance, but they were crying out to Jesus, "Lord, mercy, have mercy on us, Son of David." That was a bold statement, a bold declaration, one that gets repeated twice in that short passage. It's a messianic designation. Jesus, the Messiah, indeed is the seed of David. He is the Son of David. And that, of course, is a big part of Matthew's argument and how he is presenting Jesus in this gospel account. And Matthew reminds us that it was two blind men who were acknowledging that truth about his identity. And Steve did a good job of reminding us that these were not people that were part of the social elite of the day. These were people living on the peripheral of society. And in their response to addressing Jesus and to acknowledging him as being the Son of David, Jesus ends up doing what the Messiah, the Son of David, should do in accordance with Old Testament prophets. He heals them. He healed the eyes of the two blind men. He can do that because he is the Son of David. He is the Messiah. And so that account beautifully sets up what happens and what's going to happen here in our passage this morning. That if indeed Jesus is the Messiah, if indeed he is the Son of David, and he is, then what should that look like? What might one expect? And so our passage this morning helps us with that. It gives us a sneak preview, if you will. And I'd like to suggest that in this passage we're going to see two outstanding characteristics, two outstanding attributes of the Messiah that are dominant, that are interwoven together. And so I encourage you to keep your eye out for those. One of those characteristics, one of those attributes helps us appreciate why Jesus is so attractive to people. The other characteristic is one that's designed to bring us comfort, to bring us encouragement. And the blending of these two characteristics and attributes together is one that's designed to motivate a compelling response. It was designed to evoke a response in the days of Jesus. And as Matthew records it, it was designed to evoke a response for his listeners in the early church. And it's designed to evoke that same kind of response from us today. There's a lot going on in this passage that's before us. There's certainly lots of excitement. There's lots of energy. There's lots of noise. There's lots of anticipation. I mean, it's the kind of stuff that can keep you on the edge of your seat, and especially if you didn't know the rest of the story. This is Passover time in Jerusalem. This is the time when the numbers in the city, those participants who came to the city and descended upon the city as Jews came from all over the place to participate in these feasts, there was this great, huge influx of numbers. You remember there were at least 3 annual feasts that the fathers and the sons were required to go to Jerusalem for. It was a requirement. Moms and daughters and the whole family could come, but fathers and the sons, it was mandatory. Estimates range from there being some 2 to 3 million people that would descend upon Jerusalem for an occasion like this. Jerusalem's not a big city. You can imagine the stir that was there in the city as they came together. That's why we have these huge crowds that come before us in our passage this morning. There's some significant movement here in Matthew's gospel that we're confronted with in this passage. There's significant geographical movement. Jesus and the disciples have been on their way to Jerusalem. Jesus has said that he needed to go to Jerusalem. He announced earlier that he was going to suffer, and he was going to suffer at the hands of the religious leaders. He has to go to Jerusalem. And today, he arrives. So there's this geographical movement. The events that we have here in Matthew's gospel, beginning at chapter 21 through to 28, happen within 6 days. This is where the lens of the camera everything comes to kind of a screeching halt, slow delivery. We focus in on this last week of the earthly ministry of Jesus before the crucifixion. Not only is there significant movement geographically, there's a significant change in Jesus' ministry that we are confronted with here in this passage. A different way in which Jesus is going to handle himself. And Matthew's gospel captures that literally as he continues to develop his argument of who Jesus is and the purpose for which he has come. And what Jesus does here is profoundly significant. He now is going to openly, publicly, transparently declare that he is the Messiah. He's going to put that out there, and he's going to put that out there in a big way. He is the long-awaited Messiah, and he presents himself as such. And that's a change in this respect. Throughout this gospel account, as well as the other gospel accounts, you'll remember that we often have Jesus performing miracles. Miracles, of course, that are consistent, as I mentioned before, with what the Old Testament prophets said the Messiah would do. But frequently, Jesus will perform these miracles, and then what does he say to people? Don't tell anybody, all right? Don't spread it. And the reason for that is that the time's not right. He would say that the hour is not yet here. The people that he's dealing with have these associations and this mental awareness and framework as to what the coming Messiah meant. And they can only think of it in terms of the political aspect. We're going to see that continues today. But that's what they're thinking of. A deliverer who's going to come and who's going to deliver them as a nation. And that's not the agenda of Jesus. And he will say that there is the time when that will be, the right time will be for it to all be public. And here in Matthew 21, that day has come. The time has now come when Jesus is going to openly, transparently present himself to the nation. Could not be more apparent than what he's saying, that he indeed is the Messiah. He's going to put himself on public display. And so the two blind men have openly declared it, what we saw last week. And now today, Jesus himself will publicly declare it in kind of this object lesson format. The passage before us is known as the triumphal entry, what we traditionally think of as Palm Sunday. So with all that as background, let's kind of break into our passage. Structurally, the passage can be broken down into three major moves that confront us. And the first comes in verses 1 through 5, where we have the preparations that are made for Jesus' entrance into the city of Jerusalem. We pick it up in verses 1 through 3, and the text says, "Now when they," that is Jesus and the disciples, "drew near to Jerusalem and came to Bethphage to the Mount of Olives." The disciples have been on what is called this Jericho Road. They have been traveling some 15 to 17 miles from Jericho to Jerusalem. It's not a particularly easy journey. From Jericho to Jerusalem represents an elevation of some 3,000 to 3,500 feet, almost a mile. They're going uphill. We'd always rather go downhill, but they're going uphill. It hasn't been an easy trek. And they came to Bethphage, the name of the town, or perhaps it's a region. It's located on the eastern side of the Mount of Olives, this north-south ridge that extends for some 2.5 miles, lying just east of Jerusalem. And from here, Jesus gives some specific instructions to the disciples. He says to them, and we read in verse 2, "Go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you shall say, 'The Lord needs them,' and he will send them at once." There's a number of amazing things here. First of all, on the surface, it seems like a strange command. But we're going to see that the disciples have made progress. They take it in stride, and they just proceed and do what he tells them to do. So good for them. We're making progress here. Secondly, we can't help but not escape this aspect of the Lord's sovereignty in the midst of all this. We see his knowledge of all things, right? He says, "Go into the village in front of you, and immediately you're going to find a donkey tied and a colt with her." How does he know that? How is he aware of that? He says, "Untie it, and if anybody gives you any grief, if there's any pushback, if anybody questions you, just say, 'The Lord needs them.' The sovereign Lord needs them." And when the owner finds out, he'll be fine with that. There's nothing in the text to indicate that Jesus has gone on a scouting mission and has put all these arrangements in place. I suppose he could have. But the simple reading of the text is just that Jesus knows all things. He is, after all, the sovereign one. This is no big deal for him. So in this action, we see the disciples being obedient to this unusual task. We see the characteristic of the Lord's sovereignty. And thirdly, we're going to see the significance of the task. Why did Jesus need the colt? We usually do not associate kingship with a lowly donkey. We would typically think of a great procession of a king that would be an impressive white military horse with lots of pageantry and everything else associated with it. That's typically what we would think of. Wouldn't naturally think of a donkey, would naturally think of a colt. It's true that there is a precedent in Israel that's found back in 1 Kings chapter 1, has to do with when Solomon was anointed as king. And King David, nearing the end of his life, and Solomon is going to be anointed as his successor. He brings people before him, and he said to them, and I quote, "Take with you the servants of your Lord, and have Solomon my son ride on my own mule, and bring him down to Gion. And let Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet there anoint him king over Israel. Then blow the trumpet and say, 'Long live King Solomon.'" So there is a precedent of an anointing of a king, the presentation of a king riding on a donkey. But it's not normative. It's not the first thing that you think of. There's actually something else here. Jesus is asking for a donkey, and he's not just asking for a donkey, he's asking for a colt. He's asking for the foal of a donkey. This was no menial, insignificant task that he has assigned to these disciples. Because what Jesus was going to do in this event that's going to unfold here in this chapter was he was going to fulfill Old Testament prophecy as spoken by Zechariah. And so verse 4 of Matthew chapter 21 says, "This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet." The prophet is Zechariah, saying, "Say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey and on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden." It's interesting as we compare Matthew's rendering of this quotation of Zechariah that there are some elements that are not included. So Matthew is using most of the quote, but portions of the quote. For example, Zechariah's prophecy opens up with the words, "Rejoice greatly." You look at verse 5 and you don't see that. That part of the quote isn't there. It's not there because ultimately what's going to transpire here in Matthew 21 isn't going to be a time of great rejoicing and the subsequent actions. Not going to be a time of great rejoicing. In fact, Jesus is actually going to weep over the city. He's going to weep over the lostness of the city because of their ultimate rejection, because of judgment that will come. And so while there are elements of Zechariah's rendering that's not included here, and there's others, the way that Matthew uses it, Matthew does use this quotation in the broad sense to talk about the fulfillment of it and to emphasize a particular aspect of it. And that particular point of emphasis is the demonstration of humility. The humility that is going to characterize and surround Jesus as he makes this presentation of himself going into Jerusalem. Humility that is seen first and foremost of him riding on a donkey, but not just a donkey, riding on the colt, riding on the foal of a donkey. There will be no great military procession. There will be no great awesome external display of magnificence and pageantry. Won't be any of that. We've been reminded, haven't we, throughout Matthew's gospel that this kingdom that Jesus comes to bring and that he calls you and I to be a part of is an upside-down kingdom. Takes our normal way of thinking, takes our normal box of expectations and empties it out, turns everything upside down or right side up. And Jesus is leading by way of example. He is the example par excellence of the humble one. It's one of the things that makes Jesus so attractive to people. The disciples, having been successful in securing the donkey and the colt, it's now time for the procession to begin. And so that takes us to our next move in verses 6 through 9. Matthew, the writer, reminds us that the disciples, verse 6, went and did as Jesus had directed him. And they brought the donkey and the colt and put on them their cloaks. And he sat on them. some interpretive issues here in relation to, we have the donkey, we have the colt. It says they put their cloaks and he sat on them. It's not that Jesus is straddling the two donkeys, but the idea is that he sat on the cloaks that they put on the donkey. Jesus is going to ride, obviously, the young donkey. And just like Zechariah said, that Jesus in his humility is going to ride into Jerusalem on this colt of a donkey as he makes his way towards Jerusalem. It's a marvelous display of humility. But don't miss out on the fact here that this humility is uniquely blended with a demonstration of his sovereignty, his amazing power. We've already seen it in terms of his omniscience and knowing that the colt and the donkey is going to be tied up in that village. We get another aspect of his sovereignty here. Jesus is not merely riding a donkey, but he's riding on a colt. He's not riding, if you will, on the mom. He's not riding on the adult donkey. He's riding her offspring. Luke is very explicit that this colt that he's riding is one that has never been ridden before. It's a big deal. For those who are familiar with farm life and horses and riding and that sort of thing, you realize that's no small feat. I mentioned before about growing up on a farm, and we didn't have riding horses, but we had work horses, generally a team. And I remember when we were kind of in between, and so we were going to go, and Dad was going to buy another horse. So I went with him. We looked at this horse, and the horse had a colt. So we ended up buying the both. And thought that would be a good challenge in terms of breaking the colt in and all that good stuff. We brought them home, and we kept them tied up for a while in familiar territory, and then the day came we let them loose. And the colt ran away. Ran away for weeks before we got it. I remember one day in the fall, it was October, my dad was away moose hunting 500 miles north. I like to hunt too. I wasn't doing moose hunting, so my mom came in and picked me up from high school, and I was going to go do some partridge hunting a couple hours before doing the farm chores. And just the way it was and what happened, I ended up getting lost. Fog settled in, and then it started to snow, and I got turned around. And as I make my way in this territory that I didn't realize exactly where I was, I did some circling, and partway through the circling, I realized that I'm seeing some rather large trails, and I'm seeing some evidence that initially I thought was some moose, and then realized, no, this isn't moose. This is where our colt is hanging out. And so when Dad gets back from hunting, I said, Dad, I think I found out where the colt is. I don't know how we're going to get it, but I think it... Anyway, we got it. All of this to say that when you have a colt and something that is unbroken, it is no small feat to ride that colt. You don't just jump on it as if it's all broken in. Unless, of course, you're Jesus. And he can do that. He's the sovereign one. And it is this veiled reference to his messiahship as he rides in on the colt. He is the Lord. He is the sovereign one. There is nothing beyond the reach of his domain. He is master over all of creation, over the winds and over the storms, over the demonic, over all animals, wild and domestic, and over kingdoms as well. As these people watch what is happening, they know that there's something special going on. In verse 4, it tells us that most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. People throwing garments on the ground was part of an ancient custom in terms of royal processions. Opportunity for people to show their subjection, to show their allegiance, show their devotion. Palm branches were a symbol of nationalism and a symbol of victory. As these people witness what is happening, there'd be some in the crowd who were familiar with the scriptures. They remembered, they knew the words of Zechariah the prophet. And in their minds, it was clear what Jesus was doing. They understood that Jesus was presenting himself as king. There might even have been some who, familiar with 1 Kings and the anointing of Solomon, who said, this is just like with Solomon. When David had him to ride the donkey as he was to be anointed king. And for many in this crowd, remember, we have these large crowds that are there for the Passover. And they hear about this prophet. They hear about this one. And so they are there. They've come out to join. And they begin to lead the procession into Jerusalem. There are those coming behind Jesus, his disciples and others of his close followers who are coming behind him. There's a time of great excitement. This is the king. And the reason that we know that this is what they were thinking is because of the words that they spoke when they saw Jesus riding on the colt. The text says to us that they were saying, verse 9, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. This phrase, Hosanna to the Son of David, the idea of Hosanna is really a cry for help. It literally means save. It comes from Psalm 118, where we have this cry that is expressed by the psalmist as he says, "O Lord, save us." In this time of this exuberance and excitement and energy, they cried out for their need of salvation. Lord, save us. Save us. But they spoke better than they knew. Because when they cry out like that, they're expecting some kind of political deliverance. That's not the kind of deliverance and salvation that Jesus came to provide them. He's not riding the military horse. He hasn't come with a great army and display of military might and power. He's come on a colt. He's come in peace. He's come in humility. His deliverance is a deliverance from sin, for which he would lay down his life in order to make atonement for them. He came not in force and power and might, but he came as the gentle one, came as the humble one, who would provide deliverance for their greatest need. Not the greatest need as they perceived it, but the greatest need as God knew it. Our passage reminds us that in this great procession of the crowds that are going before Jesus and some coming before him, we pick it up here in verse 10, where we read, "And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up. They said, 'Who is this?'" As Jesus enters Jerusalem and on the road covered with coats and garments and palm branches, with all these crowds shouting, it creates no small stir in the city. And as they make their way into Jerusalem, there is this question, who is this? Who is this? And the response given is, in view of everything we've just seen in this passage, is not what we would expect to hear. The answer from the crowds is that this is the prophet, Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee. Not everyone agrees as to identifying who these crowds are. But it does seem that this last response is not in keeping with everything that has been happening in this great processional. And there's the suggestion that the crowd of the processional is probably these people who have come from Galilee and those regions into the area who have been part of this great exclamation and this great celebration. And now as they come into the city of Jerusalem, and this stir is created, that those who are saying, oh, this is the prophet, are those the Jerusalemites, if you will. And there's a certain tragedy, there's a certain sadness that comes with the answer. In the words of one commentator, the crowd's answer here does not echo the messianic language of 21 and verse 9. And again, one has said Jesus is described accurately yet inadequately as the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee. Who is he? Is he a prophet? Well, yeah. Is he the prophet from Nazareth? Yeah. Is he that prophet from Nazareth that's been causing all the grief? Stirring up all the trouble down there? Yeah, he's that prophet. But the tragedy, of course, is that Jesus is not just a prophet. And he's not just one of many in the line of prophets that have come from the nation. And he's not just the prophet from Nazareth. Jesus is the prophet, period. And he's not only the prophet, he's the king. He's the king. He's presented himself here to the people, to the nation, as the one who is humble. He comes in peace and humility, riding on the foal of a donkey. But make no mistake, this one who comes in humility is the sovereign Lord. The one for whom nothing is beyond the realm of his domain, and he's the one who is worthy of worship. Now, the people largely miss it. He gets explained away as just the prophet. Certainly the people in Jerusalem as a whole are not ready for him. One has said, much is strange about this triumphal entry. It's a larger quote. The king is clothed plainly, not in military or royal splendor. He rides a young donkey, not a war horse. He is meek, not bellicose. This combination of the trappings of power and glory with the imagery of humility sends mixed signals that perplex all Jerusalem. The crowd's shouts, at the same time correct and incorrect, are highly ironic. They correctly describe Jesus with messianic language, but they incorrectly understand the language. They rightly quote messianic texts, but they wrongly model their Messiah after a conquering military hero. And as the narrative unfolds, the triumphal entry is shown in reality to be a very tragic entry. Jesus' exit will not be as his entrance. End quote. Tragically, they spoke better than they knew. Tragically, they did better than they knew. Thankfully, Jesus comes to us this morning in the way that he came to the people of our passage. He comes to us this morning as the humble one. And he offers salvation. Salvation that he would have offered to these people, but they would reject. But he offers us salvation this morning. He's the humble one. He's the one who has said that he came not to be served, but to serve, and to lay down his life, a ransom for many. The one who humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on the cross. It's this kind of humility, it's this kind of servanthood which Jesus displayed that makes him so attractive to people. He is the humble one. We're also reminded, and these people will discover as well, God's people will, that there will come a future day when Jesus comes not as the humble one, that he will come riding the great horse. He will come as the military conqueror. He will come in judgment. Today, he comes in humility, and he offers us salvation, the one who laid down his life for the likes of you and the likes of me. The invitation is to come to him. But he also presents us to us this morning the one who is the sovereign one, the one who is Lord, the one for whom nothing is beyond the reach of his realm or his domain, the one who is in control of all things, the one who knows what to us is the unknown, the one who is able to control all things, the one who is the Lord of hosts, the one who has his hands on everything. And that's a truth that's designed to bring us comfort. Whatever your experience is this morning, whatever we are encountering and whatever we are dealing with, and the mysteries that can be wrapped up in that, there is a comfort and there is a solace when we realize that he is the one who is the sovereign one. Nothing enters into our lives that does not come across his desk, if you will. He is the Lord. Because he is the sovereign one, he's the one who is worthy to be worshipped. He is worthy of us figuratively taking off our garments, our coats, and laying everything before him. Lord, it's yours. It's all yours. And you're worthy of that expression of devotion and submission and worship. He is the sovereign one. Our wills, our desires, our plans, our aspirations, how we would like to rewrite the script, he's worthy to have that all laid at his feet. This Jesus, the humble yet sovereign one, is worthy of our worship today, now. May God be gracious to us this week so that this might be our experience, that we might get to live out the reality of that in such a way so that we'll not be like those in our passage who spoke and who did better than they knew. Father, thank you for Jesus, your Son. We delight in him this morning. We thank you for him. Thank you that he is the exalted one, that he is the Lord, he is the eternal one. Thank you that he is the one who presents himself to us this morning in humility as the one who is our Savior, who laid down his life for us, but the one who is also the Lord, the one for whom nothing is beyond his reach, this one who is humble, this one who is sovereign, is worthy of our worship now, today.